Welcome to part 3 of Wisdom and Womanhood. This is going to be a good one. Okay, so in this video, we're going to go over some of the differences that we find in male and female reproductive biology. And one thing that I should say before we get started is that in making this video, I'm actually assuming that the viewer already has a basic understanding of the anatomy of the reproductive systems in men and women, and that you have a basic understanding of sexual intercourse and how babies are made, because I will not be introducing those things to you in this video. But I will be referring to that information in this and other videos, and I will be using just a few illustrations of some anatomy that you should be able to recognize. So if you don't have that basic understanding, I would recommend that you stop this video and you find some other sources for that information, reputable sources for that information, and you do some research on your own before you watch this video. Sorry if that's disappointing to anyone out there. Bunch of people going, oh, this is not what we anticipated. But yeah, it's not going to be that. And I understand why, why some people might be disappointed, especially if you're young. Reproductive anatomy and sexual intercourse are topics that, they fall into that category that I mentioned briefly in part 2, right? Of the things that you didn't know about when you were a kid. And that is part of that process of discovery, right? Now that you're developing into an adult, those topics should take on some more significance. You should be getting very strong emotional and physical signals that the use of your reproductive system is something that would bring you joy. You're probably noticing the opposite sex more. You might have a strong desire to be around babies and children. And those are clues that your reproductive system can bring you joy. It's meant to, anyway, and it will, provided you understand the proper use of that system and you make good choices based on that understanding. And so that's the purpose of this video, to give you some information about your biology that will form the basis for those good decisions. And this video is going to blast you with a lot of information. This is the longest video of the entire series, and it's just packed. And the younger you are, the newer all of it is going to be to you, more than likely. So you're probably going to want to watch this video more than once. I really tried to make all of it very easy to understand, but there's just a lot of information to take in one sitting. And a very thorough comprehension of this information is going to help you not only in your life as you get older, but as we move into part 4 and we start discussing the proper roles and dispositions of men and women. So yeah, I'm just going to quickly put in a plug also about watching parts 1 and 2. If you haven't watched those videos already, please go back and watch them. I think it might be a little tempting to just jump straight into the biology and watch this video before the others, but I would really encourage you to not do that. So let's start by just quickly revisiting the definition for good, which says, completely or sufficiently perfect in its kind, having the physical qualities best adapted to its design and use, opposed to bad, imperfect, corrupted, impaired. In order to find out about how good your reproductive system is, we need to look at both the male and female reproductive systems because they're made to fully complement each other. And when I say complement, I don't mean they're going to say nice things about each other or flatter each other. I mean the complement that's spelled with an E, like complete, right? They're meant to complete one another. And if either one is without the other, neither one can fulfill their reproductive design. Reproduction requires both a man and a woman. And I'm not a biologist, but anyone who's taken a halfway decent biology class and any good biologist will tell you that what determines whether a person is male or female is found in their reproductive design. That's why we look to the design. That's why for millennia, people have looked to the design at birth to determine whether a person is male or female, because we can tell by the design what role an individual will naturally play in the process of human reproduction later on in life, and what they will grow into. Males will grow into men, and females will grow into women, because it's the roles they play in human reproduction that determine whether they are men or women. That's super important, okay? Now, the organs of the reproductive system are present at birth, but they're not fully developed, and so they're not fully functional, and they don't begin to go through that development until a child hits a phase of development called puberty. Children hit this phase between the ages of about 10 and 12, and that varies from one child to another, with boys typically starting that process about a year later than girls do. But it generally falls within that time frame, and that might come as a surprise to some people because most people expect to see very noticeable and observable changes in a person who's going through puberty, right? We think of puberty as a time when a person's voice changes or when your body starts to grow hair in certain places or you start dealing with acne. And we don't normally associate those things with 10 to 12-year-olds. But technically, puberty is when a person's reproductive organs fully mature, and that begins when the brain starts to produce chemicals that cause a person's primary sex organs to mature. The primary sex organs are the testes in a man and the ovaries in a woman. They're the blue structures in this picture, but the locations that they chose are terrible. I'm using this illustration to highlight the differences between the reproductive systems, not to be accurate representations of their locations. That's why I said you need to know the anatomy. So, anyway, we'll talk more about the testes and the ovaries later on in this video. But right now it's enough to know that the testes and the ovaries are internal. So you're not going to notice when puberty begins. The brain will start sending out these chemicals, and you're not going to notice their immediate effects because they take place internally. So let's talk about these chemicals I've mentioned. The body makes a lot of chemicals, and some of these chemicals belong to a category we call hormones. Hormones are chemicals that control and regulate many functions in the body. They're produced in several organs of the body, not just the brain, and each hormone has a certain chemical makeup, a certain structure that allows it to act like a key in various parts of the body. And in the drawing here on this slide, we have two imaginary hormones that differ in their structure. We've got hormone A that's rather round and hormone B that has some angles to it. And throughout the body, there will be target cells, cells that are meant to be affected by different hormones. And these target cells have what we call receptor sites that are a match to the structure of a particular hormone. Receptor sites are like locks. So when a hormone binds to them, when a hormone fits into that receptor site, the hormone acts like a key, causing some certain response within the cell. So you can see in the drawing that a target cell can be affected by one hormone or more than one hormone. We've got the target cell for hormone A on the left, and it has receptor sites that match the structure for hormone A and only hormone A. Same thing with the target cell for hormone B in the center. Receptor sites that fit the structure of hormone B and only hormone B. But you can have a target cell like the one on the right that has receptor sites for both hormone A and hormone B. And any certain kind of target cell for hormone A is going to respond in a way that is completely different from another kind of target cell. In other words, each kind of target cell will perform a completely different function, even though both kinds of cells were affected by the same hormone. It's kind of like a car key. The key to a car will open a trunk, or it'll open the doors, or it'll start the ignition. Same key, different receptors, right? With different responses to the key. So this enables hormones, just a few hormones actually, to regulate many biological activities. It takes really just a handful of hormones to tell many different types of cells what to do, and when to do it, and how much to do. So now let's go to the brain. Remember I said that puberty begins when the brain starts to release these chemicals, these hormones that act on the primary sex organs. And the structure in the brain that does this is the pituitary gland. This picture zooms in on the base of the brain where we find the pituitary gland, and we also find another structure right above it called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus and the pituitary are what we call endocrine glands. And an endocrine gland is just a structure that releases hormones directly into the bloodstream. The pituitary has two sections. There's the anterior, that's the front section, and the posterior, which is the back section. And for now, we're just going to focus on the anterior or front part. Some of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary will act directly on other target cells, and that'll be the end of it. But some of the hormones will bind to the receptor sites of target cells in other endocrine glands. So when that happens, the second endocrine gland starts to produce other hormones that are then released into the bloodstream and affect even more cells throughout the body. So there's this domino effect, and this is why the pituitary is actually called the master gland, because not only does it have that direct effect on tissues of the body, but it's also going to have an effect on other endocrine glands, which will have many more effects on different parts of the body. So two of those other endocrine glands also happen to be the primary sex organs, the testes in a man and the ovaries in a woman. And during childhood, remember, these organs don't function. But at the onset of puberty, the hypothalamus above the pituitary tells the anterior pituitary to produce two hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone, which is abbreviated as FSH, and luteinizing hormone, which is abbreviated as LH. And again, the diagram, I'm going to be apologizing for all of the diagrams that I use. I'm not an artist, and less so when it comes to illustrations I have to put on a computer. So I hope you forgive me for these. I did the best I could finding them. So yeah, the diagram here is a little misleading because it makes it seem like FSH acts only on the ovaries in women and that LH only acts on the testes in men. But in reality, these hormones are produced in both men and women, and the testes and the ovaries have receptor sites for both hormones. But because they're different structures, obviously, the functions that are activated within them are different. Okay, so now we can talk about why we call the testes and the ovaries the primary sex organs. What does primary mean? Another little definition here. Primary means first, and the testes and the ovaries are first in two ways. Number one, they are first in importance. The testes and the ovaries are the organs that produce the sperm and the eggs, respectively. And so without them, there would be no babies, no reproduction, right? We need that sperm and we need those eggs to be reproductive, so the testes and the ovaries are quite important. That's number one. Number two, they're first in order or in sequence. In response to the hormones that are released from the pituitary gland, the testes and the ovaries start to act like endocrine glands in their own right. They start to produce those other hormones that cause other things to happen in many more places of the body. And it's those other hormones that are different in men and women, and they cause men and women to be significantly different. They cause the other organs of the reproductive system to mature. They cause those organs to function properly, and they cause those outwardly noticeable aspects of puberty that we talked about before, the voice change and the hair growth and all that. Those are called secondary sex characteristics. Why are they secondary? Because they're secondary to the activation of the testes and the ovaries as endocrine glands. And this is why once you start noticing those outwardly observable changes, puberty is actually well underway, because these primary sex organs have already been activated by the hormones first produced in the brain. Now, men and women both produce FSH and LH in the brain, but everything after that is different. So we're going to take a look at male and female development separately, and we're going to start with the male reproductive biology, because the reproductive system in a man is a lot simpler than the reproductive system in a woman. And by that, I don't mean to say that it's somehow less impressive or less amazing in its design, because it's not. It's just that it's less complicated. And compared to female biology, it's a lot easier to understand, as you will see. So let's go back to the brain for a minute. We're going to talk about the effects that FSH and LH have on the testes. Again, why are the testes the primary sex organs? They're first in importance, right? Because they generate sperm. And in men, it's FSH that causes the testes to generate sperm. Men are not born with any sperm, and they're actually incapable of producing sperm through their infancy and childhood. Sperm generation doesn't start until puberty, and it's FSH that makes that happen. The testes are also first in order because they need to produce that other hormone, right? That affects the other reproductive organs, and it's LH that causes the testes to act as its own endocrine gland and to start producing another hormone called testosterone. Once these two functions are activated, the production of sperm and the production of testosterone, they don't stop. Under, what you would call normal circumstances, they don't stop because the cells in the testes that get activated to do these things never go away as a man ages. You'll see a decline in the production of those things as a man becomes very elderly, but throughout a man's lifetime, those things stay pretty constant, and they generally stay that way for a long time. So, a man's fertility. Let's talk about that. A man's fertility is the ability to cause a pregnancy. And it's actually determined by a lot of factors, and we're not going to talk about all of them in this video, but a couple of those factors, the biggest ones probably, are the number of sperm a man produces and the quality of sperm a man produces. A woman's body presents some serious challenges to fertilization, and a man's sperm count needs to be high to begin with. And those sperm need to be high quality, because the conditions of the woman's reproductive tract and the egg itself, actually, will only allow the strongest, fastest, healthiest sperm to cause fertilization. This graph, which is obviously one I put together myself, is given to represent a man's fertility at different ages, both quantity and quality of sperm. And I didn't bother putting anything in childhood or adolescence. In childhood, it's nothing. And in adolescence, it's climbing until it hits a peak around the age of 18 or 19. And it stays at that peak for quite some time. It actually doesn't even begin to decline until a man is in his 30s, and that decline is pretty slow. But when a man gets to about his mid-40s, that decline takes a steep downturn. And by the time he's 50, a man's fertility is about half of what it was at its peak, with a slower decline after that as a man ages. But it's important to realize that because the cells that generate that sperm never go away, a man can boost his fertility by doing things like exercising regularly and eating a good diet and getting good sleep and just being healthy, right? Cut out all of the bad stuff, smoking, alcohol, drugs, stuff like that, stress. And so a man kind of has a little bit of control as to how that decline progresses. So those are some important things to know about sperm production. And that's what FSH causes. Now let's talk about what LH does. LH causes the testes to produce testosterone. Testosterone is the masculinizing hormone. It's the hormone that causes a boy to develop all of the characteristics that we typically associate with an adult man. It causes the reproductive organs to mature. It causes increases in bone density and in muscle mass and in red blood cell production, so that a man is significantly more capable than a boy is to participate in activities that require greater strength and greater oxygen carrying capacity and greater endurance. Testosterone also increases memory. It enlarges the larynx, which is the voice box, so a man will have a deeper, more resonant voice than a boy will. It promotes hair growth, and it increases skin collagen. Testosterone also increases confidence, so that with all of this newfound strength and endurance and memory, a man feels more confident to use those things and to engage the world in a way that he did not when he was just a boy. Lastly, testosterone increases sex drive, because you want a man to go out and find a mate who will fully complement him and make him fully capable of using his reproductive system in a proper way. I want to point out here, just very quickly, that testosterone is all about increase. It's all about improvement. Increases in bone density and muscle mass and memory and skin collagen and confidence, all of those things are made to make a man significantly better, so that a man can go out and make the world significantly better. And we'll talk more about that in part 4. Like sperm production, testosterone production doesn't stop. This is an illustration of how testosterone levels in men vary at different ages. And if I had to change one little thing on this graphic, I would bring down the level of testosterone at about age 40. But it comes close to the scientific consensus. You can see that testosterone levels shoot up between the ages of 10 and 20 as a male is going through puberty. And he actually hits the highest level of testosterone production when he's about 18 or 19, just like sperm production. That level stays high through their 20s, and somewhere in their 30s, a man's testosterone level will start to drop slowly at a rate of about 1% a year. And there's a slow, steady decline in that testosterone production until men hit their 70s, which I find really interesting because if you'll remember back to the fertility chart, a man's fertility was cut in half at about age 50. Do you remember that? And the testosterone production doesn't undergo a significant decline until a man is in his 70s, which means that a man can father a child when he's 50 and still have a significant amount of vitality to raise that child into adulthood. Lastly, I will mention that, again, a man can boost his testosterone levels, even as age would cause them to decline, just like his fertility. He can engage in weight training and exercise and a healthy diet and all of those things that are just considered part of a healthy lifestyle. So that's all I'm going to say about male reproductive biology. And now we're going to move on to female reproductive biology. This is where it gets a little complicated. So let's go back to the brain because things start simply enough there. We have follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, that are released into the bloodstream by the pituitary gland. And that's about where the similarities end, because in men, the release of FSH and LH is constant, and there are no major fluctuations. But in women, the release of FSH and LH fluctuate quite a bit, and those fluctuations and their effects are what cause a woman's menstrual cycle. Maybe you've seen an illustration that looks something like this, that's supposed to show you what happens during a menstrual cycle. But I think that if you jump right into an illustration like this, it can get kind of confusing. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the ovary, because if you really want to understand what happens during a woman's menstrual cycle, you need to understand what happens within the ovary as a result of those fluctuations in FSH and LH. So let's take a look at this diagram in terms of those fluctuations, okay? A woman's menstrual cycle lasts on average about 28 days. And if you split this diagram in half, the top half can be used to explain what happens during the first 14 days of a woman's menstrual cycle. This is when FSH is the dominant hormone released by the pituitary in the brain. What does FSH stand for? Follicle stimulating hormone. And you can see that in the ovaries, we have follicles. Follicles are little fluid-filled sacs or compartments, and the most immature of these follicles are called primordial follicles. And each primordial follicle contains a primary ovum, or an immature egg. Remember, primary means first. So we have the first stage of the egg, and actually of the follicle too. It's a primordial follicle because this is its primary order, or its first order of development. Follicle-stimulating hormone does exactly what its name implies. It stimulates the follicles, and two things happen as a result. The egg inside of a follicle matures so that it's ready for fertilization, and in combination with low levels of LH, FSH causes the follicle to start producing a hormone called estrogen. Estrogen is the feminizing hormone. It's the hormone that causes a girl to develop all of the characteristics that we typically associate with an adult woman. It causes the reproductive organs to mature. It promotes breast development. And when she's pregnant, it prepares a woman's breasts for milk production. It maintains a healthy birth canal and causes a woman's hip bones to widen in preparation for childbirth. It regulates sex drive so that a woman's desire to engage in sexual intercourse will actually correspond with the most fertile time of her cycle. It promotes fat deposits, which also increases the production of estrogen because fat cells actually produce a certain type of estrogen. It increases skin collagen, and it promotes hair growth. It maintains bone density. It prevents memory loss, and it regulates body temperature, and it regulates cholesterol levels. Okay, so the main thing that I want you to notice here is that estrogen maintains. It does not improve, not to the degree that testosterone improves a man. Estrogen is what keeps a woman looking young and attractive, and it's part of the design that the follicles produce estrogen and mature eggs at the same time. Estrogen production and egg production go together so that a woman will be the most attractive to a man during the most fertile years of her life, when she's the most capable of having a baby. That's good design. So now let's take a look at the second half of a woman's menstrual cycle. We have a follicle that is fully developed, so we have an egg that is mature and ready to be fertilized, and we also have estrogen at the peak of its monthly production. And in response to that high level of estrogen, the pituitary is told to release a large dose of LH, which causes the follicle to rupture, and the egg is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube. That release of the egg from the ovary is called ovulation, and it's when an egg becomes capable of being fertilized. That ruptured follicle, we change its name. Now we call it a corpus luteum, which is just Latin for yellow body. Corpus is like corpse, right? It's a body, and luteum is just Latin for yellow, so it's a yellow body. And the LH from the pituitary continues to act on cells in the corpus luteum, and they produce another hormone called progesterone. Progesterone means in behalf of gestation or pro-pregnancy. Progesterone's main job is to make the uterus suitable for a pregnancy. now that there's a mature egg in the fallopian tube that could be fertilized. It causes the inner lining of the uterus to thicken, and it increases the blood supply. It vascularizes the uterus so that a fertilized egg can have a nice, comfortable, nourishing place to grow. If the egg does not get fertilized, then the corpus luteum ages and it degenerates and it eventually collapses and dies, which makes the production of progesterone impossible. And when that progesterone level drops, nothing is telling the uterus to prepare for pregnancy. And so the inner lining of the uterus is shed and the woman starts her period, which marks day 1 of the next menstrual cycle. Some people used to say that the shedding of that inner lining of the uterus was like shedding tears, and that a woman's period was a way the woman's body mourned the fact that she didn't become pregnant that month. So progesterone's main effect is to create conditions in the uterus that are suitable for a pregnancy. It also prevents contractions of the uterus. It regulates blood pressure, which is very important during pregnancy. It improves mood, it improves sleep, and it promotes a healthy nervous system. I'm not going to say too much more about progesterone here. Okay, so now let's go back to this slide, and hopefully this illustration will make a little bit more sense. We have a woman's menstrual cycle that lasts on average about 28 days. The first half of that menstrual cycle is called the follicular phase because the follicles in the ovary are developing. The second half of that menstrual cycle is called the luteal phase because now we have a corpus luteum. And the event that changes a follicle to a corpus luteum is the release of an egg from a follicle in the ovary, which is called ovulation. Those squiggly lines in the middle there, they should begin to make some more sense too. We have follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, in the green, that is released by the anterior pituitary. And as that level climbs during the follicular phase, estrogen in the pink also increases because it's those stimulated follicles that produce estrogen. When estrogen reaches its peak, the pituitary is told to release a large surge of LH, which is represented by the yellow line. That surge causes the follicle to rupture and it causes the egg to be released into the fallopian tube. LH continues to work on the corpus luteum, causing it to produce progesterone, which is represented by the purple line. The increasing progesterone causes the inner lining of the uterus, represented by the bottom drawing, to vascularize and to thicken, creating a nice, comfortable, nourishing spot for a fertilized egg. But if the egg does not get fertilized, then the corpus luteum eventually degenerates and dies, the progesterone levels drop, the inner lining of the uterus is shed, and the woman starts her period, marking day 1 of her next menstrual cycle. So it's complicated. I told you that it would be complicated, but that's as complicated as it gets. Or maybe I should say that that's as complicated as any part of a woman's reproductive life will be. There is one little wrench we have to throw into this because the point of a reproductive system is to reproduce. And we have not talked about what happens when a woman gets pregnant. So let's do that. I said that progesterone prepares the uterus for pregnancy. It also maintains a pregnancy. And if you paid attention to that last section on the menstrual cycle, you should be saying to yourself, wait a minute, how can progesterone maintain a pregnancy if the corpus luteum that produces that progesterone degenerates and dies, making the production of progesterone impossible? That's a very good question. And if you ask that question, good job, bonus points for you. Let's talk about what happens after ovulation. When a mature egg is released from the ovary, it carries half of the genetic information that is necessary to begin a new human life. And a single sperm carries the other half of that genetic information. And when the sperm from the man gives its genetic information to a woman's egg, that's called fertilization. An egg only has about a 12 to 24-hour window of opportunity to be fertilized. That's different from the sperm. Sperm can actually survive within a woman's reproductive tract for up to 5 days. So the egg's life is much shorter. After that 12 to 24-hour window, the egg will dissolve and disintegrate. If a man's sperm reaches that egg within that 12 to 24-hour window, it will attempt to penetrate the outer layer of the egg and contribute its half of the genetic information. And if it does, if it's successful in penetrating the outer layer, there are proteins in that outer layer of the egg that change. And that change in the proteins makes the egg impenetrable to any other sperm. Only the first sperm to penetrate that egg gets to contribute its half of the genetic information. No other sperm are allowed to do that. Now that the genetic information is complete, it starts to replicate, and the process of cellular division begins, and it continues as that fertilized egg travels through the fallopian tube and into the uterus. Once it's in the uterus, it implants into those thick, vascularized tissues that were prepared by the progesterone from the corpus luteum. And as soon as that fertilized egg implants, there are cells that start to form an organ called the placenta, which is what connects the developing baby to the mother. Those cells start producing another hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, which is a rather long name. We call it HCG for short. But I only mention that because the names of all of these hormones, they actually tell us what they are and what they do. And human chorionic gonadotropin tells us that this is a hormone that is produced by that brand new human life. And the purpose of this hormone is to send a signal from that human life to the mother's primary sex organ. It's the ovary. The target is the ovary. More specifically, it's the corpus luteum in the ovary. HCG tells the corpus luteum to keep producing progesterone. And it's kind of a race against the clock. That new human life has to pump out as much HCG as possible, as quickly as possible. Because if it doesn't, that corpus luteum is going to degenerate and die, the progesterone will drop, the inner lining of the uterus is going to be shed, and that pregnancy will be aborted. HCG is only produced in those high quantities when there's a new human life developing. The mother does not produce HCG, not in those high quantities. And because of that, it's HCG that pregnancy tests were designed to detect. The people that developed those tests, they knew that if you found HCG at those high levels in a woman, it could only be because she was pregnant. So if you ever take a pregnancy test and that result comes back positive, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at the HCG. You're not looking at a hormone from your body trying to tell you that you're pregnant. You're looking at your baby's first communication to you. Do you realize what it's trying to tell you? It's trying to tell you to keep it alive. That's pretty cool if you think about it. Now, the production of HCG does not go on indefinitely because the placenta eventually reaches a point where it actually produces its own progesterone and estrogen, and you can see that in this next chart. HCG rises quickly at implantation, and it causes the corpus luteum to keep on producing that progesterone, and then the HCG starts to drop because the placenta grows, and it eventually produces so much estrogen and progesterone that the mother's blood levels of those hormones will be as high as 6 times what they are at their peak when a woman is not pregnant. In fact, a woman will have more progesterone and estrogen circulate through her system in one pregnancy than she will over the course of her whole lifetime if she were to never become pregnant. And it's those high levels of estrogen in particular that make a woman appear especially young and radiant when they're pregnant. That's why people will often say that a pregnant woman glows. It's because of that high level of estrogen. After a pregnancy, those hormone levels plummet, and a woman's body will go through recovery, and she'll go through the necessary changes to breastfeed, and she'll eventually return to a regular menstrual cycle. She will not, however, return to her pre-baby self. After a woman has her first baby, she will never be the same. She's not meant to be the same, actually. And I'm not just talking physically, okay? Although women are easily preoccupied with that, getting their pre-baby body back. And a woman should take care of herself physically, but there are physical things that will never be the same. And I'm also talking about changes that are not physical. Mentally, emotionally, and behaviorally, she's meant to never be the same. And I'll talk some more about that a little later on in the video, and even more in part 4. Right now, I just want you to notice that this is a lot of change. This is way more change than you'll ever see in a man. Even when she's pregnant, that's kind of the time when she's the most constant, hormonally speaking. Like if you look at this chart, estrogen and progesterone rise, and then they plateau just a little bit, and that That's not like the squiggly lines that we saw before, right? And even that is short-lived. And her body is going to go through some other physical changes, not really hormonal, but other physical changes to accommodate the change in the developing baby. And so constancy is not a thing for a woman. She's going to change, and she's going to change a lot through her prime reproductive years. All of those changes are good. They're all part of the design. They are what make a woman physically beautiful and attractive and entirely capable of giving life to another human being. But they also come with a lot of other side effects. A woman's hormones, being complicated, make everything else about a woman complicated, from her emotions to her digestion. Let's take a look at this list. These are some of the things that a woman can experience as her hormones fluctuate during her prime reproductive years. And I'm not going to read through this whole list, but allow me to highlight just a few of them, okay? We have cramping, nausea and vomiting, mood swings, general irritability, changes in sexual desire, weight gain, acne, headaches. This is just a small sampling of some of the wonderful things that women get to experience when they're going through their prime reproductive years. And now that you understand what happens during your menstrual cycle, I'm actually going to recommend that you keep track of your menstrual cycle and all of these things and anything else that you notice about yourself during that cycle. Because while there are some things on this list that you can't change, there are some things that you can. And tracking your menstrual cycle will help you make positive changes wherever they're possible. Now, the good news is that all of these things don't last forever. But unfortunately, that's also kind of the bad news. Let's go back to the ovary for a few minutes because I need to talk about another difference between men and women. Remember I said that the men don't produce sperm until puberty, and that the cells that produce sperm and testosterone never go away. The same is not true for women. A female is born with immature eggs inside of immature follicles, and both of those things do go away. While she's still in her mother's womb, a female produces 6 to 7 million immature follicles and eggs long before birth, about 5 months before birth. But those follicles very quickly start to die, and they continue to die until they're all gone, and she will never produce more. And that has some pretty serious implications for both a woman's fertility and her hormone production, doesn't it? Let's just talk about the fertility for a minute, okay? By the time she's born, a female will only have about 1 million eggs, down from that 6 or 7 million. And by puberty, she will only have about 400,000 to 500,000. Then that rate of decline starts to level out quite a bit between the time that a woman hits puberty and her early 30s, because you don't want those eggs dying off during the prime reproductive years, right? But once a woman hits her mid-30s, those eggs have been around for a while, since before that woman was born. And the eggs that are left are more likely to have genetic abnormalities, which increase the risk of birth defects. And so the eggs increasingly die off again once a woman is in her mid-30s, and they will continue to die off until a woman can no longer produce a mature egg that is suitable for fertilization. This is why women are said to have a biological clock. Maybe you've heard somebody say that about a woman, that her biological clock is ticking. And remember, those eggs are inside follicles. It's not just the eggs that die off over the course of a woman's life, it's the follicles too. And it's the follicles that produce estrogen. So once a woman is in her 30s, her estrogen levels are going to decline dramatically, and that is going to affect her menstrual cycle and her ability to maintain her youthfulness. Again, in this illustration, I would lower the level of estrogen in the 40-year-old woman somewhere down around her armpits or so, because that estrogen production has already started to seriously decline when a woman was in her 30s. And generally, somewhere in her 40s, there won't be enough hormone production or a balance of estrogen and progesterone to cause a regular menstrual cycle. And so a woman's periods will start to become irregular. The cycle itself might become irregular. And typically between the ages of 45 and 55, sometimes even before that, hormone production will fall below a threshold and her menstrual cycles will stop completely. And when a woman has gone through 12 months without a period, she is said to have gone through menopause and she is no longer capable of having children. A woman gets a little bit of estrogen production from fat cells after menopause, but it's different from the form of estrogen that's produced by the ovaries, and it's far less than what is produced by the ovaries before menopause. And with less estrogen, not only can a woman not maintain her fertility, she also can't maintain her youthfulness. That's what estrogen does, remember? And as those estrogen levels drop, a woman is going to age significantly. She's going to lose the energy and strength that she had earlier in her life that would have helped her raise and care for children. And those losses are made apparent in the woman's appearance. Looks are tied to hormone production in both men and women. Looks are meant to be an indication of both fertility and the vitality needed to care for children. And so starting in her mid-30s, a woman's going to age and she's going to start looking less and less attractive to men. That's different for men. Men can look attractive to women for much longer because the cells that produce testosterone never go away. And one thing to note here is that because of that continued testosterone production, men have a sex drive that stays with them as they age, and men of all ages are designed to be physically attracted to women who are in their prime reproductive years. Culturally, we're taught to see that as weird, older men with significantly younger women. But biologically, if you think about it, that's actually really good design. It would be very poor design if men in their 50s who could still father a child were attracted to women who were in their 50s, because those women would be beyond their prime. They're more likely to have eggs with genetic defects, and they might not even be able to have children anymore at all. A man's attraction to younger women makes the most out of his reproductive longevity, especially when you consider the fact that men have that added ability to increase both their sperm production and their testosterone as they age. Women do not have that ability. They cannot increase their eggs or their estrogen because those follicles go away. Now, before I conclude this video, we're going to discuss one last hormone. And to do that, we need to go back to the brain. We talked about the effects of FSH and LH, and you'll recall that those two hormones are released into the bloodstream by the anterior pituitary. This last hormone is released by the posterior pituitary, and it is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is not produced in the posterior pituitary. It's actually produced in the hypothalamus, and it's just stored in the posterior pituitary until the brain is told to release it into the bloodstream. But oxytocin plays some very important roles in the whole reproductive process. This illustration depicts it having an effect on the uterus and female breast tissue. And that's because women normally have higher levels of oxytocin than men, and because oxytocin has a more noticeable physiological effect on women, meaning that it affects the functions of a woman's body more noticeably. It's oxytocin that causes the contractions of a woman's uterus during labor, which allows the baby to move from the uterus into the birth canal. And it's oxytocin that causes a mother's milk to move through the milk ducts in her breasts so that a baby can get that milk when it breastfeeds. In men, oxytocin has effects too, but they're far less noticeable. It helps move sperm through the male reproductive system, and it also plays a part in testosterone production. But the one thing about oxytocin in both men and women is that it's not just released into the bloodstream. It's also released into the central nervous system, and it acts like a neurotransmitter, okay? It acts on the brain itself. It affects our perceptions of our relationships with others, and it causes both men and women to bond to the people that they have close relationships with. And so oxytocin is often called the love hormone. It's released when you have close, positive, physical interactions with people. Your body releases oxytocin when you're hugging or holding hands or snuggling or cuddling. And obviously, sexual activity is an extension of that close physical contact. And oxytocin is predictably released in higher amounts when that happens. But it's also released when you have close interactions that are not physical, too. And those perceptions of more familiar and even intimate relationships affect our behavior towards other people to varying degrees. Oxytocin deepens the relationships that we have with others. In men, it makes them better providers and protectors of those that they have stronger attachments to. And in women, it fosters feelings of trust and commitment and loyalty, especially towards a mate with whom a woman is the most intimate, and that is called pair bonding. So you get the bonding effects of oxytocin in close relationships, but the two activities in which oxytocin is released the most and where it has, hands down, the greatest effect on the brain are labor and breastfeeding, which exclude men. Men do not go into labor and they do not breastfeed, by definition, okay? Men do not have the physical organs that would allow them to do that. And the reason why it has such a great effect is twofold. First of all, oxytocin is produced by the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary over the course of an entire pregnancy. And as a woman approaches the end of her pregnancy, the rate of that production increases so that by the time she goes into labor, a woman has the greatest possible amount of oxytocin to release from that posterior pituitary. Not only that, the number of receptor sites increases in the mother over that same period of time and in the same way in uterine tissue, which facilitates labor and delivery because it helps the uterus contract, and in the brain. And that's so important because in the 15 minutes surrounding a baby's birth, a woman will have more oxytocin released from the posterior pituitary than any other time in her life. And she will also have the highest number of receptor sites in her brain than at any other time in her life. And the combination of those high levels of oxytocin in the brain, along with the high number of oxytocin receptor sites in the brain, enable the mother to bond with her baby as soon as it is born. And she feels a measure of love and generosity and devotion and empathy that is greater than anything she was previously even capable of experiencing. This experience is so significant that it affects maternal behavior, with studies showing a strong correlation between high oxytocin levels in a mother during childbirth and good mothering activity later on. The high number of receptor sites in the brain stays high for about 12 hours after delivery, too. And it's during that time that a mother will generally breastfeed her baby. And the sucking sensation at a woman's breast tells the brain to release even more oxytocin, right? Because it's the oxytocin that causes the milk to flow to that baby. And it gives the mother another opportunity for her to experience close physical contact with more oxytocin released into the brain while the number of receptors for oxytocin in the brain are still high. Something I need to point out here too is the fact that this experience that a woman has when her baby is born, it only happens to the fullest degree when a woman has a spontaneous vaginal delivery, meaning she goes into labor on her own, and the uterus goes through the whole process of contracting to help push that baby through the birth canal. That's because oxytocin has to be released directly into the central nervous system in order to bind to those receptor sites in the brain. And that doesn't happen to the same degree during a C-section or an induction where the mother is given a synthetic form of oxytocin to start labor. So that wraps up this video on reproductive biology. Thank you for hanging in there and finishing this video. I know that it was a ton of information to get through, but I hope you learned a lot about your design. And I hope you come back to learn how to put that design to good use in part 4.